Um, Good evening, everyone. My name is Wyatt Wegerson. I'm one of the owners here at Bookworks. On behalf of the NHCC and celebrating Latin American history and culture, we are very happy to have Dariel Suarez and Jennifer De Leon. Jennifer De Leon is an author, editor, speaker, creative writing professor who lives outside of Boston. She is the editor of Wise Latinas. She's a writer in residence for the Boston Public Library, and her first book of fiction was Don't Ask Me Where I'm From, and fantastic read. If you haven't read it, you should buy it today. And then her new book is White Space, Essays on Culture, Race, and Writing. Dariel Suarez grew up in Havana, Cuba, and he came to the United States. And his debut story collection, Kind of Solitude, received the 2017 Spokane Prize for Short Fiction. And his new book, Playwright's House, is available today. And I thank you both. If you'd like to add anything in honoring of the place where we are here in Albuquerque, I just want to honor the Tiwa people. Part of Latin culture is indigenous and people who were here before the colonists. Anyway, thank you so much, Dariel and Jennifer De Leon. I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you everybody for showing up.
Thank you, Wyatt. Thanks for that introduction. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jen, for being here to kick off this is the National Hispanic Heritage Month. I know that you have a lot of events happening this month, and I hope by the end of tonight you can share some of that about what's coming up. I have a few things as well. But I'm excited to be here and talk once again with you. For those who may not know, Jen and I know each other. We're sort of colleagues from Grove Street, this writing center in Boston. We're neighbors, basically. Right now, we're like 5 minutes away from each other in Southborough, Massachusetts. And it's just really fun to do these events with folks whom we know and admire and respect. And so I'm excited to talk about your book, White Space, but just in general, your writing and intersection of identity and writing and many other things. But I think that, I'm going to let you talk and do a little introduction as well. But I sort of wanted to, I know that we're going to read a little bit from our work as well. So I'm going to throw it to you, let you say a few things, and then maybe you can kick us off with a short reading, and then I'll do the same.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yes, thank you everyone for being here. I know that there's a lot competing for your time, and I actually I love any opportunity to share stories and share some of our work. Thank you, Bookworks, especially for hosting the event, and what a special day. This is my favorite time of year. It's the busiest time of year, but it's definitely my favorite. This is something that when I was growing up, I couldn't even dream big enough to imagine a moment like this one, where I'm able to share my work with readers and be in conversation with another Latino author and talk about our stories and Latinx identity and migration and craft. It's really an honor. So thank you everyone for being here and for supporting our books. I am going to read a standalone essay from my collection, White Space. And this is a collection where I write essays that explore the many white spaces that I've been a part of my whole life, in school, in workplaces, in internships. And these are essays where I also grapple with my own identity and my own search and longing to become a writer and an author. And so it's really about the white space of the page in that way as well. When I was 28, I quit my job and I booked a one-way ticket to Guatemala, which is where both of my parents were born and grew up. And I really wanted to live there and develop my Spanish, learn more about the history of Central America, and write a novel. And so I set out to do that, much to my parents' confusion, because they just didn't understand why I would quit my job and leave health insurance and dip into savings to go to a country that they tried to leave, essentially. And so this piece is called Lucky Woman, and it's a page and a half, and it's speculative nonfiction. So I'm writing this piece about a story that I have heard many times growing up. So I wasn't there to experience it, but I feel like I may as well have been, because I heard the story so many times. So it's called Lucky Woman. I have heard the story many times, how 3 decades after deserting my grandmother and their 8 children in Guatemala, my grandfather asked for her forgiveness. I imagine her, Luisa, standing in my parents' kitchen in Massachusetts, using the side of her wrinkled hand to wipe crumbs from the counter. She tosses them into the sink, a metal box where she can make hot water run miraculously by turning the left handle to the right. No need for a horseback ride to the river. No need even for a horse. Here there are cars. Here there are wide paved roads. Of all the girls in the villages that dotted the southern coast of Guatemala, Luisa was the one my grandfather chose. They married in the town of Tiquizate, where they signed a document in the presence of an alcalde, the mayor. They lived on a farm in a simple house that sat beside a long row of lime trees in one direction, and in the other, a dusty dirt path that led to the rest of the world. Their days, milking cows, fishing, hanging cured meat from the ceiling, making love in the country darkness. They had 6 boys. My father was number 3. Women called Luisa lucky. Her husband was handsome and smart. When he didn't come home for days, she figured he was just smoking hand-rolled cigarettes with communists. When she learned he'd been with another woman, she forgave him. He was the only man she had ever loved. They had a 7th baby, a girl. They had no money. They traded limes for avocados, sugar, and shoelaces. My grandfather found work at the United Fruit Company. At the end of each day, he brought home bunches of bananas and powdered milk in cans whose labels were written in English. Before long, he left again. She forgave him again. They had their 8th child, another girl. Then he stepped on that dusty road for the last time. After 30 rainy seasons of not sending so much as a single letter, he sits now on a sand-colored recliner with his hands folded on his lap. Luisa stands in the doorway. She'd heard he was coming. She'd also heard his second wife left him. He clears his throat. "Take me back," he says. She squints at him for several seconds. He is the only man she ever loved. Yet she remembers how, when one of their sons went missing and she searched for him alone under the moonlight, she whispered her husband's name across the fields too, but he never answered. "Luisa," he whispers now. Her mouth is one straight line. She stares at his iron shirt and wire-rimmed glasses. He looks old, she thinks. Finally, she tells him, "What you want is a nurse, not a wife." At that, he lowers his bald head. Later, she would hear that he married a 3rd time and that they had 1 girl, deaf at birth.
Wow, thank you for reading that, Jen. That's incredible. Yeah, if you haven't read White Space, and if you haven't read Jen's work in general, like, you should absolutely read. Just how what I love about your work is how you're able to bring us so close and so quickly with the images and the descriptions, and at the same time have this expansive perspective. I love that little smoking cigarettes or cigars with the communist.
Yeah.
Just because I'm Cuban, and
Right.
but anyway, we'll talk more about
Yeah, sure. I want to hear you read.
Yeah, so I'm not gonna also, embarrass you. But yeah, I'm just gonna quickly read from my novel, The Playwright's House, and I'm just gonna read again about a page, just a quick passage, and you don't really need to know much other than this is the main character, Sergey, or as we would say in Cuba, Sergey, sort of thinking about his relationship to Havana and his perception of the city as a kid. They stepped beyond Lovers Park and, further to the right, the monumental statue of Dominican-born General Maximo Gomez. The illustrious 10 Years' War and War of Independence main strategist, depicted on horseback, was propped on a dozen columns, in turn supported by a series of sculptures narrating some of his heroics. Sergey had been brought here on an elementary school field trip. Across from the park, he got to see El Castillo de la Punta. Together with El Morro, the Spanish built it to protect the entrance to the harbor. He also got to see the entrance to El Túnel de La Habana. The tunnel left the biggest impression on him when his teacher, a sweet lady serendipitously named Dulce, indicated that the road dipped below the harbor and continued all the way underwater until it emerged behind El Morro. Sergey marveled at the ability of a man-made structure to withstand so much weight, his excitement amplified by the possibility that it could drown at any moment. A couple of years later, Felipe, his father, took him and Victor to El Morro. Sergey was already in secondary school. He could now remember flickering lights rolling by as the bus sped inside the tunnel, the echoing rumbles and swooshes of adjacent cars. He kept thinking about the sea above him, about the tunnel caving in and tons of water engulfing vehicle after vehicle. From El Morro, Felipe and the boys beheld the sprawling splendor that was Havana. The Malecón promenade curved away from them, graceful as a fine blade. Regardless of the physical desolation of so many neglected buildings, taken as a whole, Havana inspired awe. Felipe had described it once as an expansive cluster of varied architecture, unified by a lingering colonial aesthetic. At its core, the mystery was so abundant, he said, so overwhelming, that it transformed itself into something evocative and beautiful. A young Sergey had understood what his father meant, but he was more captivated by something else: the vibrant blue of the water, the music of the waves lapping at the rocks below the fortress like a bristled broom gently sweeping, the air emboldened by the height and open spaces. His senses were acutely stirred. It put him in a meditative trance as he observed Havana. He didn't think of history, the revolution, martyrs, or was inculcated at school. It was as if he were suddenly capable of simplifying everything, as if he were maturing in a moment spelled, finding himself able to do what only grown people could, willfully fall in love with his country. And I'll stop there.
Oh, that was beautiful. Graceful as a fine blade. That's a great line.
I may have stolen it. I don't know.
No one will
It does
ever
look
know.
like a blade to me when I look at the photos and when I've been there, obviously, and when I look at it. But anyway, yeah, I may have stolen
Yeah.
that.
Oh my gosh, it's so great. It's so great also to just, we've known each other for years, and to be able to share our work over the years, it's such an honor, and it's a joy. We just keep doing it. We're not quitting. We will never quit.
Now,
Yeah.
now.
So I have, yeah,
yeah.
questions. I feel like let's dive in.
All right,
And
let's do it.
if others have questions too, this is a nice intimate group. So definitely feel like, you can definitely ask us questions. So do you want to kick it off? Should I?
Yeah, do you mind if I kick it off?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask you sort of an obvious question, or maybe it isn't so obvious to some folks, but I think we get, and I say we as in like Latinx folks, BIPOC folks, first generation immigrant writers, etc. So I'm gonna ask it anyway,
Yeah.
and then maybe I'm gonna undercut myself later, but I'm curious as to, and I'm genuinely curious as to sort of the intersection of craft and identity for you and how they play out in your work, and meaning, when I think of that for myself, obviously, because I grew up in Cuba, the way that I perceive literature, the way that I think of writing in terms of genres, in terms of my influences, it's not the typical, what people consider the typical American MFA way. And in fact, I had to push against some of that as I was learning how to write and going to school. So there are many different ways in which craft sort of plays out for me because of my identity. So I'm curious, in your case, as you're writing your work, whether it's your fiction or your nonfiction, you know, because you're also exploring identity in the actual content of it, I'm curious if you ever think about that intersection, if there and if there's any way that intersection, and if there's any way that you consciously engage with craft that might be related to, you know, whether it's your identity or Latinx identity in general. So I hope that question made sense, but.
Yes, completely. It's something that I've thought about a lot more recently, but I will say that when I first started writing to be published, I wrote very differently than I do now. I used to try and sound like a writer. I used to write in a way that I thought would be accepted, you know, by the New Yorker or something. And what I mean is I tried to write like a dead white man. And I went through my James Salter phase, my Ernest Hemingway phase, my Richard Yates phase, and I admire all their work. And I thought, oh, if I just write like them, then maybe someone will publish me. And that didn't work. And I realized that I had to put publishing outside of my mind when I was writing, when I was creating. And what I started to do that helped hone my voice, I think, was I really thought about the audience. Like, who am I writing for? I'm not writing for readers of the New Yorker. Like, they can read my books. That would be great. Anyone is welcome. But I was writing specifically for my younger self and for an audience that I felt was not often written to in publishing and in literature. So I wrote the way that I grew up hearing stories. They were told very directly. They were full of images. There was always humor, as sad as it was. And I thought, I'm going to try that. And that's when I feel like I really started to hone my own style, I guess. And even now, it's really exciting when like teenagers will say to me, I didn't know you could write a book like that. You sound like my Tia. Or like that, you sound like me. Like, I think that in my head. And to me, that's the greatest compliment. Like, yes, because that's who I was writing for. And with White Space, I didn't know I was writing a book when I wrote these essays. I was writing one essay at a time. But now that I look at it, I realize, like in this piece that I just read, Lucky Woman, it's a piece of speculative nonfiction. Myself now knows that term. But growing up, I didn't know that term. I just knew that we hear a lot of stories, and it's like stories and stories, and they're passed down, and it's like the person is in another country or they've passed away or whatever it is. And they're like, oh yeah, I know that story, remember? And it, you know, it kind of has its own energy. And so I thought, I want to write an essay about how my grandfather had the guts to leave my grandmother when they had just had their 8th baby, to abandon her, and then how he had the guts, the gall, to 30 years later ask for her back. I mean, that is a story that I heard so many times, like, and every time it was like, what did Abuela say? What did she say? Even though I knew the answer, I just wanted to hear the story again. And she said no. And I feel like that story became baked into the fabric of my identity in ways that I didn't fully understand growing up. But through writing, I was able to kind of make space for that experience. And yeah, now there's that fancy term, speculative nonfiction. But again, I didn't know that. And so that's a style that I hope to bring in. And that's a way that I hope identity intersects with craft and structure. And that's just, you know, one example. But yeah, it's great. It feels freeing to be like, I could write anything. I can write in whatever way. It doesn't have to be stuffy and, you know, New Yorker-ish, not to bash on the New Yorker. I'd love to be published in the New Yorker.
Yeah, but it's funny how, you know, having to wade through all of that to get to a place where you start to discover that voice and even just the craft, right? So much of that resonates because for me, the names might have been a little bit different. Maybe it wasn't
Yeah.
Zolter, but it was Carver, you know, and, you know, I was sort of told who to write, you know, read this and
Yes.
read that. And so anyway, we'll talk more about that because I do have other questions related to that, but it's strange that in order to find our voice, in addition to that, to the difficult process of just doing that, which I think is probably difficult for any writer, no matter what, we have to sort of also navigate all these other things that we're told
Right.
and taught that this is the way to do it, right? This is the way that
Right.
it's done, which it's not true, first of all.
Right.
There are a ton of different ways, you know, globally to write. But also kind of oftentimes goes against your own identity in many ways. So
Yeah.
so thank you for sharing that. That's great.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. So I'd love to ask you, like, when sort of related, but you know, when you were writing The Playwright's House, which is a beautiful novel and everybody should read it and buy it. I'm wondering, was there a question that you were asking, like a problem you were, or a knot that you were trying to untie, like trying to kind of figure out as you were drafting, and, you know, getting more, I guess, into the heart of the novel?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer probably varies depending on the day that you ask me, because I'm sure that there's a few questions that I probably was trying to both consciously and subconsciously answer. And what's funny is that in writing fiction, you end up just asking more questions. You don't necessarily answer all the questions you have. But that's the fun, you know, and doing that. I would say that one of the central things that came up, and I'm also stealing this a little bit from one of my readers, one of my early readers, and a good friend of mine, Artem, this Ukrainian American fellow MFA student who became I think a lifelong friend. And he kind of pointed out, you know, in one of the early drafts that he felt like the main question I had was, what does it mean and look like to be a hero in a country where you really can't be one? Meaning, like, in order to, whatever that means, right? And the word hero, it's overblown, and you know, we're not talking in the romantic sense. We're talking more about someone who has to sacrifice in order to help someone else. And what does that look like? What are the sacrifices look like? What are the things that you do? And does it mean that you're a hero? And so, you know, in my epilogue, like, you know, I end up sort of having a reference to Galileo, you know, and like that, the play and the question of a hero, you know, and what does it mean to have a hero? And actually, sad is the land that needs one, right? Rather than like, you know, so I think it's sort of like a central question for me, because Cuba is such a complicated place, and because it's a country that I left. And to this day, even though I was a kid and I was 14 years old, I kind of wonder whether it was a cowardly decision to do that, right? Especially now with everything that's happening in Cuba, I look at what the artists are going through there. I look what people are doing. It's something that I never would have not only maybe done myself. Again, I left young, so I'm not sure, but also that it was kind of unthinkable when I was there in the 90s and when I left, just because the situation was different. Castro was still in power, and you know. And so anyway, you know, in writing this book and making it a political book and talking about the state, talking about art, I just had that question of like, what does a young person whose family gets, you know, put in a very difficult position, very high stakes position, is willing to sacrifice or not sacrifice? And does that make him a hero or not? Which, you know, I don't think it does, but again, it's more for the reader to answer that question. But anyway, that to me, I think, and I hadn't articulated that way when I started writing the book. I think my friend was the one who helped me by pointing that out, and he pointed out to some chapters in particular and things like that. And then I ended up adding, you know, the epilogue and everything after because of that. But anyway, I think that's one of the main questions that I have. In a communist country, in a complicated country like Cuba, what are you willing to sacrifice if you have to really help somebody? So anyway, there's a lot more I could say, but I think
that's amazing. Those are big questions, and questions that it takes a novel, like The Room in a novel, to answer, if you will. You know, I mean, not that they're like answerable, but the scope of a novel is certainly needed for that. I mean, I suppose you could do it in a short story too, but I'm glad you wrote this in a novel.
Yeah, I just gave myself more time to figure it out.
Yeah. Right.
It's kind of cheating, right? In a short story, you kind of got to get to the point at some point, you know. With the novel, I mean, in the novel you do too, but I feel like you do have that scope. And
Yeah.
anyway, but actually, this conversation is kind of evolving in a natural way that kind of leads to my next question in a way, because I'm very curious. I feel like a lot of emerging writers and young writers struggle with this, which is, and I get this question a lot in classes, like, how do I know what to write about?
Yeah.
The big question, you know, they tell you, write what you know, write what you don't know. I
Mhm.
mean, you get all kinds of dictums and all kinds of stuff about writing, but I'm curious in your case, because you've written fantastic fiction, like your novel, Don't Ask Me Where I'm From, which is amazing and you all should get it. And White Space, which shows your range as a writer, you know, how do you decide, when did you know,
Yeah.
the topics, the themes, the characters, the people, the lives that you wanted to get into, the kinds of questions you wanted to ask? I feel like a lot of writers struggle with that, and I struggle with that, I'm sure, and I'm sure you did too, with like that, how do I figure this out? So it's not just craft, but it's really, how do I know when this is the thing or the place or the people, et cetera, that I really want to write about?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm still asking those questions, I mean, I think it's different for every piece of work. And again, I started writing stories where there were patterns, and this was the pattern. The brown protagonist would make a mistake or do something bad, and there would be a nice white lady who would come in and save the day. And I am not kidding. It was like every story I wrote that ended up happening, whether it was about a housekeeper who stole something, or a teenage girl who sneaks her boyfriend in. The out was always an adult, a white adult, like saving her. And I had an editor point this out, a reader, and it was mind blowing. Talk about your subconscious and in just so much history and internalization of social systems, all of that, like being like out on the page. And once I kind of could see that and observe that, I was able to address it. And one thing that really helped me figure out like what to write about is taking workshops with Junot Diaz, like summer after summer. He was incredible in so many ways. And he would just, like, no BS, like tell us, like, why are you writing this? Who are you writing this for? What are you trying to say? What do you want to say? And he gave us permission. I feel he gave me permission to write stories that were so simple, but had this depth at the same time. It could be a mother and daughter, and the daughter wants to buy a dress. It's never as simple as that. And when I'm trying to figure out what to work on next, I just kind of, I figure out like what is that? And yeah, what's that knot kind of right in your chest? Like, what do I need to like detangle? What do I need to figure out? And the great thing about essays is that I work on them several at a time. Like I'll write a draft of an essay and put it away for a year, 2 years, and then come back to it. And I have more distance from it. And I used to hear writers say that, and I'm like, no, you don't do that. You can't possibly do that. But it's kind of happening, I think, because I have lots of pots on the stove. So it feels more possible, like, okay, all right, like the cookies are baking. I'm going to work on this rice. I'm going to thaw the meat on the counter. It's just different books, different essays, different projects. But I would say with Don't Ask Me Where I'm From, this was right after the 2016 election. And I felt like many people in the country, like I had been stepped on by a giant foot, and I just felt hopeless. And I thought, what am I waiting for? I have to write the book that I needed. And Toni Morrison has that beautiful, famous quote, right? If there's a book in the world that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you need to be the one to write it. And for me, that was that book. And I just thought, the world is on fire. The least I could do is show up on the page and write for them. They fight for them, and that's how I kind of really got into writing Don't Ask Me Where I'm From and Liliana's voice. And it was a lot of fun. I feel like when you hit that vein, when you find the vein, you're just like, it's like easier. That's a mixed metaphor. But anyway, I think you know what I mean. Um, basically, I felt like I was on the right path finally. And it actually wasn't hard in that sense. But I know, how about you? How do you decide what to work on? What are you working on right now?
Yeah. Well, I first wanted to say, as a reader, as a sort of fellow reader, thank you for writing the book, writing that book, writing Don't Ask Me Where I'm From, especially at a time where I'm sure a lot of people just couldn't write, It was kind of the opposite for a lot of folks. I think they became frozen. I know that I struggled for a little while because that was right around the time where I was also working on my novel, and it was difficult, it was sort of and I think it takes a lot of strength, and it is important. And when you writers like yourself were able to push through and able to actually find that connection and get a book out into the world. And also with White Space, what's fascinating to me is that you mentioned earlier how you work on these pieces individually, these essays, right? But then when you read your book, they each have an identity and very much its own. It's almost like a beautiful, like I always go back to music because I'm playing music and I'm into rock and metal and that, but it's like a classic album where like every song has its own identity and you remember every song is a classic when it's a great album, but the entire thing also works together. And I feel like White Space has all these individual pieces that are memorable, and yet it all kind of reads of a piece. And again, I love that it grips you and it brings you so close. And yet when you step out, the world that you've consumed is intimate, but it's also incredibly expansive. So anyway, I just wanted to say that because of everything you sort of mentioned. And I think for me, right now, what's funny is that I wrote this book set in Cuba, completely set in Cuba. I wanted to ignore the US, though, it finds its way into a mention or two there, because in Cuba, it's kind of inevitable. But I wanted to write a book centering in Cubans at a very specific time after the fall of the Soviet Union, and in fact, many years after, and dealing with a very particular set of problems that, no American could solve. And now, and the reason for that, as I mentioned, there were many questions that I had about Cuba, about my own identity. I grew up there, these questions of politics and art. And there are many sort of different roads that led to that book. And yet now I'm writing a book set in South Florida, where I lived for many years. It's a book that is more intercultural, dealing with a lot of different cultures. It deals with human trafficking, and it's kind of a difficult book. I'm in the middle of it, and it's very difficult to write for many reasons. I have friends who assist victims of human trafficking. I've heard a lot of stories throughout the years, and I decided one day that I wanted to tell a story that, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to pull it off, but I'm trying to do justice to the people who do that work and to that world, and to respect that reality, but also to shed light on that complexity of that reality in a place like South Florida, which gets ignored. And the only treatment that I've seen in storytelling is often like Law and Order SVU or something, where you only get the really like surfacey stuff for the sake of the plot, but they don't necessarily get into all the layers. And so it's a book that's very different from my first. It's shorter. I think it's going to be shorter. And I recently heard the Colombian writer Juan Gabriel Vázquez, who I very much love his work, and he said in an interview that every new novel he writes, it's a response, or like it's almost like a pushback against the previous book.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't know that I was doing that, but then I realized with this book that I'm writing, it feels that way. It's completely different point of view, different setting, different length, different sensibility, at least in my mind. And anyway, it's one of those things where like that question of like, how do you know what to write? Sometimes you just go with where the questions are. Sometimes you just go like, I need to know this. I need to explore this world. I've known about it for a long time. I've been thinking about it for a long time. I've never seen the book out in the world that does it justice or that does it well. Right. Can I do that? Can I be the one to do the work? And it's a good challenge to take on as a writer. And again, I don't expect necessarily to succeed, but I committed to trying it out. So I'm excited to be working on this book.
Yes.
We'll see. It's not easy. I'm telling you, I'm in the middle of it. It's hard as hell.
Oh my God, the time is flying by. I can't believe this. I'm looking at.
I know. So we could, if there is a question, I believe from Bianca. So I'm going to pause. And yes, please, if you have questions, pop them into the chat. We're happy to make the space.
Sure.
Question for you, Jen. How did your family think about the essay you just read to us? Share a family secret.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
so many secrets in the whole collection. Like that's like the tip of the iceberg. But you know, so many things to say. I mean, I used to go to the page as a way of escaping, right? And so I would put the secrets down there and everything. And never did I imagine that I would publish these stories like for strangers to read. But it's something that I started doing when I was 19. Long story short, I did an internship at Ms. Magazine. And because I did the internship, the semester afterwards, the editors wrote and said, there's room for a column by one of our interns. And so I wrote a piece about going to the gynecologist for the first time as a young Latina trying to get birth control. And I specifically asked the assistant not to use my home address or my health insurance. I was going to pay cash because I did not want my parents to be billed because they would know that I was there to get birth control. And this was totally taboo in our culture, right? And so I faced a lot of, now I know to call them microaggressions, right? Where they said, a PO box, you're in college, and the nurse spoke to me in Spanish and said, hablas inglés? And it was just like horror after horror. And then finally, they still mailed the bill to my parents. And my mother showed up on campus with the bill. And she was in my dorm room and she slid the envelope across my desk. And tears started coming down my face immediately. I couldn't even look at her. I was so ashamed. And then she surprised me by saying, you know what? I'm proud of you. And you're making choices and decisions and thinking about your future. And you know what? I'm proud. I couldn't believe it. And then I started crying even more. And so I wrote about this for the column from Ms. Magazine, and they wanted to publish it. And I thought, oh my God, I can't shame my mother twice, right? Like there's no way that this is going to be in a national magazine. But I wanted to. It would have been my first publication, right? And so I called her and I said, they want to publish this, but I don't think I'm going to do it. I don't want to do it. And she said, ¿Qué? She's like, you're definitely going to do it. Call them right now and tell them que sí. And I was so happy. And so I feel like she gave me the ultimate green light. Like, you can write about anything. I know you'll do it with dignity and humility and respect, but it's important to share these stories. It really is. And so that has kind of fueled a lot of how I feel about sharing these secrets. And there are more in the book, about my father, about my own body dysmorphia and issues with being obsessive about going to the gym, and how that plays into whiteness and the ideal body, and how I was striving for that for so long. And so there are different iterations, different explorations of white space in that way. And now the book's out, so it's like, oh, well, it hasn't been translated in Spanish yet, though. Then we'll talk. Because then the whole familia in Guatemala, they'll read it. But even then, I think, they'll be proud. I think there's nothing I wrote about and published that I wouldn't write about and publish again. So.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing all that. And, I'm sort of using your book in a way as a model for my own explorations into nonfiction, which are very more recent, more seriously thinking about identity and being more vulnerable and honest about your life. And in my case, it was not so much fear of writing about family, but it was, or hesitation, but it's more about, what is it that I need to say? I mean, that I want to say, because fiction provides a certain distance. I can research and write outside myself a lot easier. With nonfiction, there are a different set of challenges. So your book is such a great example of how you can do all of these things at the same time, in terms of the craft. You can tell the story the way the fiction writer would, and you're funny and you're intimate and you bring culture and you're vulnerable and you have all these people who are real people and they come to live on the page, and you're in many ways honoring them, in my opinion, and by writing these complex realities, right? These honest, layered realities. And I do think that when done right, a writer is ultimately honoring life, and life is complex and life is contradictory and life isn't always great, and we all make mistakes and anyway, I appreciate you're doing that with your work in a way that just feels like you are truly saying, come check this out, come check this country out, come check these people out, come check my life out. And I just love that, Jen. So thank you for that.
Thank you. You have a question here for you.
Place as a character in stories. How do people relationships to place change over time in your stories? There can be a complex relationship between the character of the home country, the adopted country, and the protagonist. Yeah, I mean, people or characters and I think place and how it changes over time. I mean, Cuba is one of those places that, a cliche for Cubans is that, Cuba has stayed the same since the revolution, right? Nothing has changed. It hasn't been a lot to change. Same government, same system, same everything. The country has decayed, not many renovations, not many changes. But the truth is that isn't completely true. And especially now, the last 20 years, there have been more drastic changes in many different ways. And I think when you think of migration, being an immigrant myself, I'm always constantly interrogating that, my own identity, my relationship to my home country, my relationship to the places that I want to write about. And I think that the more you write and ask these questions, like what are the relationships between the individual and the place? How have they changed? How have they evolved? A lot of tension comes out, a lot of conflict comes out, a lot of history comes out. And of course, for a fiction writer, that is what the good stuff is.
Yes.
It's like I found my plot, I found my themes, I found my conflicts, I found the difference of opinions and contradictions, and the stuff that gets the characters to be alive, because now they have to contend with things and with their own changes and their own perceptions and decisions. So anyway, I've always thought of that as a central question too, relationship between person and place. And I think it takes some privilege not to really interrogate how you, I think it's inevitable for many of us, right? And particularly, whether we're immigrant writers or for generations or Latinx writers, that question of culture and identity is present, of place is present, because it's not constant. Migration, it's inherently traumatic, and it's inherently implies change of many things. And I spent 2 years crying when I came to the US. I miss my friends. I miss my language. To this day, I have an accent. This is not my first language that I'm speaking in. This is not the Dariel, the Tato, which was my nickname growing up. So you kind of give up all those things and become a slightly different person, So when I go back to Cuba, I ask my friends that, hey, am I still Tato, to you? It's like a legit question you ask. So anyway, thanks for that question. It's something that I think about.
That's a rich question, Heather. I mean, that maybe there's an essay in there, Dario.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. It's just, it's new to me, but I do have to sort of see where the good stuff is there for the nonfiction for me. And I just mean the things that I really want to write about and explore.
Absolutely. I totally see you writing essays. Like I feel like it's inevitable, because we talk a lot about these themes and issues on the level of craft and identity. And I feel like it's brewing, so that's exciting.
Yeah. So I have another question, and this one, it's pushing back on my own first question. And this idea that we get asked the types of questions that maybe white writers don't get asked as much, in terms of identity, in terms of race, in terms of culture. Where we're from, right? Don't ask me where I'm from. And I think we want to talk about these things, and it's important to talk about these things. I mean, there are many reasons why, so I'm not making fun of that at all. I think it's great. But I also think a way to celebrate our identities and our heritage is to highlight our individual experiences and tastes and likes, which may or may not align with the perception that other people have about ourselves. Right? When people find out that I used to have very long hair and I was in metal band, does not align with people's takes on a Cuban person.
Right.
You know? But I'm as Cuban as anyone else. You know, there are Cuban metalheads. You know, and that's just a silly example. But I'm curious, and I wanted to ask. You know, is there anything that may not, on the surface, you know, be attached to your particular identity or whatever way that people might perceive you or your work, that, you know, whether it's a hobby or your musical taste or anything, stuff that you're into, that you feel like it's you, you know, regardless of like everything else that people may ascribe to you. So I'm curious to celebrate that individual and the differences between us, you know, Latinx and Hispanic folks.
Yeah, I mean, growing up, I grew up speaking English and some Spanish. I could understand Spanish, but and read Spanish because we used to go to church and it was all in Spanish. And so my spirituality is very much attached to the Spanish language. Like when I pray, I pray in Spanish in my head, you know, but English was my dominant language, and it's the language I write in and talk mostly, you know, but I studied French from 6th grade all the way through the end of college and loved it. I fell in love with the language, and I lived in Paris for a semester, and I really thought I would do something with French internationally, work for an NGO or, you know, an international organization. And it was kind of random. Like sometimes people were like, what? Like I could write a paper in French, like a 5-page paper, no problem. But if you asked me to do that in Spanish, I'd be like, oh my God, I'd start sweating. Like, I don't know if I can do that. And so it surprised people, because in college, like, you know, random people in my dorm would always come up to me and say like, can you help me on my Spanish paper? It's due like in an hour, you know, and I'm like, no, I can't help you. And so I like that though. I kind of like subverting expectations. And I think it's cool even now. Sometimes I'll like start speaking in French, and my son, is the older one, is like, whoa. You know, it's like my superpower.
I would do the same.
Yeah, right. But it was really neat to live in France, and my mom came to visit. She had never been to Europe, and I remember we went to this restaurant, the Ritz, and it was a fancy place, and we sat down and opened an enormous menu, and everything was so expensive. And I felt so bad because I had brought her there, and you could see her face like, oh my God, I can't believe these prices. And so she said, you know what, forget it. Let's get whatever we want. Don't worry about the price. And I'm like, no way. This is crazy. And so we ended up getting champagne and soup, and the waiter brought us a ton of baguettes, like on repeat. And it was phenomenal, you know? And so like, anyway, that's another story, but French, that's my answer. And I played lacrosse, I played volleyball. Yes, Jhumpa Lahiri, I know. And she wrote her last 2 books in Italian. Like, I don't know if I could do that.
She's just showing off.
Yeah, I know. Je ne sais pas. Ça, c'est très difficile. Je ne sais pas si je voudrais faire ça. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So what about you, Daria? That's curious. I have that question for you, but I also totally want to ask you this question about this statistic about Massachusetts being the worst state for Latinos. This is like an actual statistic. So hopefully New Mexico is not ranked as high as Massachusetts in that regard. But I'm curious to ask you, like, in the like 4 minutes we have left, like, what is your how has it been different being a writer in Florida, a Latino writer, to give you that label, right? Like in Florida versus Massachusetts.
Yeah, and you know, the irony of all ironies here, and it was sort of illuminating to see that when you shared the article with me and the statistics, you know, which you know, when I think about it, it makes sense. Yeah. Unfortunately, but funny enough for me, I struggle with some of this in Florida in terms of being a writer. I um, couldn't find that community as much. I mean, looking back, I did find folks, and I'm still friends with them, and we still connect all the time. And many of us, funny enough, have left Florida.
Huh.
But at the time, it felt more difficult to break in, and maybe because we were specifically in Miami, and I was into the music scene first. I was into the rock metal scene, which also is difficult to do in Miami. Much,
Yeah.
the cliche is true. Much easier if you want to play salsa down there, or
Mhm.
or reggaeton or hip hop. But metal in Miami is difficult to get it off the ground. But I was connected to that world a little bit more. And so when I decided to become a writer in school, I found 2 or 3 people. I found my people, but I didn't get as much mentorship as I wanted. I had one professor, a really good professor, who was meeting with me pretty regularly. And then I ended up having a couple others who throughout the years have helped a lot. But at the time, I felt like I was kind of stuck. And I think it was also kind of an identity crisis, coming out of the whole music stuff and going into writing and not finding my place right away there. Me and my 2 closest friends who were also writers, we applied MFAs. We all got into different places outside of Florida, and we all left.
Wow.
And so coming to Boston for me in Massachusetts was a sort of a brand new world. I'd never been to the Northeast. I'd never seen snow. I've never, gone to a private school, university, and all of a sudden I'm studying with Hajin, and Sigrid units, and I'm like, what the hell's going on? I'm just a Cuban kid who barely knows the language, and I wrote a few stories, and now I'm here. This is crazy.
Yeah. Oh, that's so cool, though.
It is pretty cool, though, because once you get over that, you realize, eventually, oh yeah, I want to be here. I want to do this, and I think what's really helped, and one of the reasons why I've stuck around in the Northeast and in Boston, the Boston area, is that I found Grub Street, which, as you know, Janice, is a fabulous independent creative writing center that has a great community of writers, and now a very diverse community of writers, and very generous, very humble place. And I think that really has made a difference. And being able to work there, being able to be part of the community, having people like yourself, that has made a gigantic difference. And in hindsight, I think not having something like that in Florida was part of the issue. Is like, it was very difficult to find out. I was challenged. I took some good classes. I had some good professors at the end of the day, some good friends as well, good writer friends. But I think we all similarly felt like we had to leave in order to learn. And then now we look at Florida a little bit different. Now I'm writing about it. So, I'm returning the same way that I did with Cuba. But so I've always felt like, not necessarily like Massachusetts has like embraced me as a Latino, to be honest with you. It's still culturally very different from who I am. I just try to be myself up here, whether people take it or leave it. But I found community. And I think that's made a big difference. So hopefully things will continue to change. Our community will continue to push through. Writers like yourself and me can put out work, can do more in the community, can do more for other writers, and say we're here.
Yes.
Whether it's in French or Spanish or whatever the hell.
That's right. There you go.
You got to put up with us now. So anyway.
That's wonderful. That's like the perfect note to end on. I mean, it's like, we're here. We're here. And we're not going anywhere. And more are welcome. And it's just so great. I hope that we can improve our rank in Massachusetts for being a great state for Latinos to live in.
Yeah, for sure. So I think we've come to the end of our time. Before we sort of throw it back to Wyatt, thanks again to Bookworks, to the National Hispanic Cultural Center for co-hosting this. Please get White Space, Don't Ask Me Where I'm From, get Jen's work.
The Playwrights House, so exciting. And Wyatt, thank you so much. I mean, I want to connect with you about some books, actually, because I need to order some books. So this will be great. But everyone, thank you for being here, and please reach out. Let's put our maybe social media info in the chat.
Yeah, I'll do so. Maybe Wyatt comes back.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dariel Suarez. Mil gracias. my French, I took a month of French, and then I found out I could have an hour lunch and I could go to the beach. So I stopped taking French. My favorite phrase was "C'est une affiche," which means it's a poster. Anyway, yes, follow Dariel, follow Jennifer De Leon, keep speaking out, keep telling your stories. It's fantastic. I look forward to being in communication with you again about future work. And I know I've sold, Jennifer, your book to schools here in Albuquerque. And, you know, this is fantastic. So thank you, everybody, for coming. We appreciate you. And yeah, keep little bookstores and authors going.
Yes.
Yes, please do. Thank you all.
Our website, I'll add mine. If you'd like to order books, we're here, happy to help. And thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.